Welcome to Brainwashed, where Jake and I discuss current events from the perspective of two brainwashed, educated adults.
A humanities major and a psychology major tackle the controversial topics of the day through good old-fashioned conversation. Hi, Jamila. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I am doing great. Trying to stay nice and cold in this crazy heat wave that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the conflict between Israel and Palestine. And sadly, we have had to push this podcast back a few times trying to schedule it between me and Jamila's busy schedules. And so it might feel like it's a little outdated now, but I think it's always relevant. And I just don't just want to talk about these issues when there's random astray flare-ups. So, of course, the last thing that happened was at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I'm probably going to butcher all of the names that I pronounce in this podcast, but so hopefully no one will make fun of me for that, or please correct me. But what I really want to do is use this this topic as a way of branching out into broader topics. Like for me, I'm a humanities major. I like talking about big picture stuff. I love philosophy. So if we go down that rabbit hole, I'm always happy. And for you, Jamila, you just got a degree. Want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, yeah. So I just got my degree. I graduated in May in psychology with a minor in education. Should I talk about what I do for work / what I did as well?
Yeah, sure.
So I was a peer assistant leader, one of the lead peer assistant leaders. So I was in charge of all of the trainings, particularly social justice. I did a whole entire curriculum on social justice that I never even got to finish the whole thing, but that's okay. I made all of the PowerPoints to all the books, part of the Student Leadership Academy. My capstone was also social justice related. I now, which my job is not really related, but I now work as an ABA therapist. So that's applied behavior analysis therapist with kids who have autism or ASD. And I do that full time.
Awesome.
That's it. Not me.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, just the bare minimum, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, we had the same job on campus. I was a peer assistant leader. Jamila was like I call her my pseudo boss student. Yeah. She was the leader of the leaders. But yeah, I absolutely have a passion for education. Love working with students. I am going into education later on in life, trying to get a graduate degree in education in social sciences. So I want to talk about history, like a big old nerd. But yeah, I think what I wanted to do was use the Israel-Palestinian conflict as a little bit of a lens into a broader issue of injustice, oppression. We can talk about social justice, politics in America and around the globe. And I value Jamila's opinion greatly. We've had many conversations in the past about all sorts of stuff. My favorite is when it gets philosophical.
Yeah.
She always likes to give me a nice right hook with her psychology facts and stuff like that. So it's very, very fun talking to Jamila. But this is an area that both of us aren't super familiar with. But the reason why I wanted to talk about it was because obviously the nation is incredibly divided. I say that with a smile on my face because it just feels so cliche to say at this point. But we're incredibly polarized. And I talk to people all of the time, mostly family members, sadly enough, about these sorts of issues. And it never seems to get any better. And I think one of the main reasons why is because people, I guess, on the right of me, always think that I am part of this grand plan, this grand strategy, this leftist narrative, and that college was an indoctrination facility. So I constantly have to defend my education. And I guess I just wanted to have a conversation with you
Hmm.
to show people what these conversations actually look like. And we're not like, I don't have any George Soros money or anything like that. So I just like two random college students talking about things that they're a little bit passionate about. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the latest Palestinian Israel Palestine conflict that happened about a little over a month ago. It was in May. It was at the Al Aqsa Mosque. And what had occurred was at the end of Ramadan, a group of Muslims were praying and protesting. And the IDF, or sorry, Israeli police forces came in and shot rubber bullets into the crowd, stun grenades, and there were a good number of people wounded. I can pull it up. I have a little bit of a fact sheet that I'm kind of cheating because I can't memorize all of this information.
Oh,
Um,
me too.
but I mean, you saw sort of the outcry on social media. Tell me a little bit about your perspective on the issue as it was happening in real time.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I guess like, and I don't know, here's my perspective on like the media. Anytime something like this happens, there's always like this big, oh, let's be a part of it, blah blah. Like everyone's all into it, and then it like dies down. And like I'm definitely guilty of that too, but there's nothing that is like long lasting. And people are reposting, and I reposted too, which is fine. I mean, I reposted
Mm.
from Hebatula. She told me to go onto her story and like message me on like Snapchat and was like, go into my story, screenshot these, post them on your story. I was like, okay, I'll do it. um and so just seeing a lot of like, I mean, and it's good to see too, like it's good to see people talking about, or talking, right? Like it's not really talking, it's social media, but just
Yeah,
kind of posting it and putting it up there. But definitely just the same posts over and over again. And I'm not on social media too much, but it's good to see. It's definitely good to see. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement last summer really heightened this more too, because there was a lot of talk about white silence and not
mm,
saying anything and all of this stuff. And so like you saw a lot more white people posting on social media, and so now this comes up and it's another opportunity for white people to post on social media, I guess, if that makes sense. I don't
definitely. I saw a ton of it as well. I am probably on social media a little bit more. I love to like repost all of those things. Like I call them, and I include myself in this. It's infographic warriors. I myself am one because I'll see something on Instagram that'll be like, holy crap, everyone else needs to see this. Boom. But like, do I actually think it's making a difference? No. Plus, there's a lot of misinformation on social media,
know.
which is what, like, because it was everywhere. Like, you couldn't get away from the conversation. But like you said, this like quote unquote conversation that was being had through random repostings on social media. That sparked my interest in this topic. And I have some figures here. So after the initial um, police raid at the mosque, 205 Palestinians and 17 Israeli officers were wounded. And so what happened after that is there was Hamas, which is the leading like governing body in Gaza, which is near where this occurred. Um, they sent out an ultimatum saying that if you don't remove Israel, if you don't remove your forces by a certain time, I think it was like 6 p.m., we will retaliate. And that's exactly what happened. They didn't get their forces out in time. Hamas fired over 200 rockets into Israel. And then, like, the conflict was on. Israel retaliated with airstrikes of their own. And one thing that was the center of the conversation was the disproportionate attacks. Of course, like no one wants to condone violence ever whatsoever. Like people, like especially me and you, we've acknowledged that like both sides have certain areas in which they are morally wrong. Like rocket strikes from Hamas, of course, terrible, especially when Israeli citizens are wounded. But then what happened after that was Israel sent over a bunch of airstrikes, and they used it as they, which has become a pattern. They used it as a way of um, gaining a little bit more territory, introducing new settlements, which is what the Palestinians were originally protesting against, were the settlements in like the West Bank, and encroaching on Palestinian territory. And so both sides feel threatened at all times. It's massive fear, right? Um, but let me see. The final numbers were after the ceasefire, which was 11 days later, there were 232 Palestinians who were killed, and 12 people in Israel were killed by both sides' bombings. So a lot of death. But the first thing that strikes out is how disproportionate it is. And that was the center of the conversation on social media. I watched a lot of YouTube videos, read a lot of articles, and there's a lot of outrage because of how much more Israel was bombarding Palestine. And I had a conversation with a friend about this, and he was very pro-Israel, and I take more of a pro-Palestine stance. But I believe in a two-state solution, and he got very angry because he believed, no names whatsoever, but he said that the Palestinians were squatters. He claimed it was Jewish land from centuries and centuries ago, right? And this topic has a rich history, but he was completely ignoring like the instance that just happened, the situation that was currently unfolding. And I kept trying to say, hey, look, man, like Israel, I get, like we all understand Israel has a right to defend themselves. Like no one wants rockets thrown into their country. However, it's got to stop at a certain point, right? And with Israel having the military backing of the United States, I think that puts them in more of a position that would say, hey, you need to be the bigger man here, I guess. Unfortunately, I hate to use like this weird language, but like, yeah. Would you agree with something like that?
Yeah, and like, well, here are my thoughts. The thing is that like the key words here are disproportionate and historical significance. And I think that like when people who are pro-Israel talk like that, they're like missing that. And because you have to think about like what is the history that has happened? Essentially, Palestinians got their land taken throughout history. That's what happened many years ago. Yes, and now you have a bunch of Israelis that are living there, but like that's what happened, right? And so like they are continuously and like have historically been oppressed and disproportionately oppressed, and what's the word, experience just like, I don't know if racism is the right word, but just just like disproportionately treated, not equally, right? Like not just today but in history. And so we have to look at that, and then to sit here and say like, oh, it's pro-Israel, whatever, blah blah blah, this is their land. It's like, no, it wasn't. Like their land was taken way way back when. And so, and I think another thing too is that like the parallels between like just being unaware and not wanting to look at the disproportionate effect is the same thing that kind of happens in America with racism. We don't want to look at the disproportionate effect that happens to Black people in America and consider the history of we had slaves for so long and there was segregation, and now there is still extreme racism, and we just don't want to look at it. And I think the parallels are just insane. Like when, Americans are looking at this situation, and then the same thing with racism in America too. It's like, no, we need to like consider the history and like what happened. And just because a single event or whatever happened doesn't mean that it's all better. So that's just what I think, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you brought up a good point about the parallels between the situation in Israel and Palestine and the situation in America regarding, well, injustice and oppression.